Welcome to the Baptist NZ Podcast Network. This is Biblical Insights, the Gospel and the Land of the Bible. Well, welcome back. I'm here with Philip Church. My name's Lauren Donegan, and we're going to be diving into some very important history today.
Cool, thanks Lauren. I'm delighted to be back. Can we start by thinking about the promises to Abraham that we finished with last time?
Yeah, it's probably a good one to remind us all of those promises.
So God, this is found in Genesis 12, and God promised Abraham three things, and I wonder how many listeners can remember those. A great nation, numerous descendants, all the families of the earth were blessed through Abraham, and then Abraham was going to be given land. To your offspring I will give this land. So
a great nation, bless the whole world,
yeah,
and that they will be given this land.
Yeah, this piece of real estate at the eastern end of the Mediterranean.
Okay, well that seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But I bet it's not.
Well,
I have a funny feeling it's not that straightforward.
But having said that, God is always faithful to his promises.
Very true.
Yeah, so we need to remember that.
All right. So I suppose we're looking at the history now and the context now of knowing what is to come by living in the present and knowing what's happening now with these promises in mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I want to go a part of history. It'll take we'll maybe not take too long. So the promise to Abraham, we're not quite sure the date, but probably maybe between 2000 and 1700 BC.
Right.
So about 4,000 years. So God promised Abraham, and then skip forward about 400 years to the time of Moses, and Abraham's descendants were in the land of Egypt. God's people were enslaved in Egypt, and if you look at Exodus chapter 2, God saw them in their slavery, and God remembered his promise to Abraham that he was going to give them land, and so God sent Moses to set them free. That's probably about Moses' time is debated, but I'm saying about 1280 BC.
And we've all seen the Moses movie, so it's easy to picture.
Yeah, you know, the one with
the water parts. That took years to animate. Did you know?
Is that right?
Yeah, it took literally years to animate.
This was Cecil B. DeMille, isn't it?
I don't know.
I think it is.
I have to Google it.
I
suppose like when you watch that movie, it all ends, yay, they leave Egypt, and then the movie ends, and then we don't go into the desert.
What happens next?
Yeah, they were like, let's not end on a low note. Let's end on a high note. Yeah.
In the desert.
Yeah.
So maybe that happened 1280.
Sure.
And then, so they had the Exodus. They had 40 years later, or one generation later, the whole generation from the Exodus died in the wilderness. And then the next generation conquered Canaan. 40 years later, say 1240 or thereabouts. And then you've got the period of what we call the Judges, the book of Judges, so that takes you up to about 1050 BC.
Yeah.
So they're in the land, and they've got these judges that God raises up. One of the really important judges was Deborah, the leader of all Israel.
Yeah.
If we're forgetting that women can lead God's people, we always should think about Deborah.
It's very true.
And Samson was there too. He wasn't that great. And some of the other ones.
He had so much potential.
He did. But
what a letdown.
What a letdown, yeah. Correct. So then, the people of Israel didn't like judges. And if you read the book of Judges, you see this cycle going on. The people did what they right in their own eyes, and they fell into sin, and God raised up a judge, and then the cycle happens again. And then at the end of Judges, it says, in those times there was no king in Israel, and all the people did what was right in their own eyes. The people wanted a king at the beginning of the book of Samuel, so God raised up King Saul.
Yeah.
And Saul reigned for 40 years. Saul's deposed, and David reigned for 40 years, and David's son Solomon reigned for 40 years. That's 1050 to 930 BC, approximately.
And Solomon was the one who built the temple, right?
Solomon was the one who built that really important temple.
Because that's when Israel was like real wealthy.
Yeah.
And so they could afford to make it real fancy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, it's called taxation. So Solomon taxed the people to build it, and there was a bit of an issue about that.
Always a downside. Yeah.
And there was some rebellion. So Solomon dies in 931 BC, and we get what we call the divided kingdom. So and the southern kingdom is called Judah, and the northern kingdom is called Israel. So it's a little complicated. The whole people are called Israel till then. Then they divide, and you've got Judah in the south and Israel in the north. Now, this is really important. From that time on, references to Israel are complicated because sometimes it refers to the entire country, but mostly it refers to the northern kingdom, even and sometimes especially when it no longer existed after 721 BC, when the people were exiled to Assyria. And this distinction applies in the rest of the Old Testament and in other early Jewish literature like the Dead Sea Scrolls and into the New Testament. And this will become significant in a later episode when we think about Romans 11.
When you say exiled, what would you explain that looking like if someone was trying to imagine it in their head?
So this fellow whose name I'm not sure how to pronounce, Tiglath-Pileser III, I think that's how you pronounce it.
I think I'll leave that to you.
He was an Assyrian general, and they had got what they call exile and deportation down to fine art. Right. So he moved in, he conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, repopulated with his people, and took all them over to Syria.
Just literally taking people out of their houses and say, out you go, you go next door. Yeah.
And you go way over beyond Assyria.
Okay.
Those people have disappeared from the map of history, from the face of history.
So this whole all lost.
The 10 northern tribes we call them the 10 lost tribes.
10? How many tribes are there total?
12 altogether. 12. So
10 out of 12.
Yeah. So Judah and Benjamin were in the south, and the other 10 were in the north. They were lost to the pages of Israel. But let's not forget, God keeps his promises.
Yep.
And I think when Paul says in Romans 11:26, all Israel will be saved.
In quotes there.
Yeah, in quotes, yeah. All Israel will be saved. I think Paul's thinking about those 10 lost tribes.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because God knows where they are, even if we don't.
I had no idea that there were 10 tribes that were lost. So there could be people wandering around today who are descendants of those missing tribes.
Yeah,
they just wouldn't know it because they'd lost their homeland and they were moved out and they lost their records maybe.
Get your DNA done.
I mean, I'm not going to give my DNA to a corporation, but you go right ahead.
Neither am I. But yeah, so it's really interesting. But God knows who they are.
Yeah, true.
And God, I think, intends to restore them because God promised Abraham many descendants.
So we lose the 10 tribes.
Yeah.
We got the 2 remaining.
Got the 2 remaining.
In the south, right?
So they're in the south.
Yeah.
And so the 10 tribes have gone in 721 BC, and the southern kingdom continues till about 587 BC.
Is the southern kingdom Judah?
Judah and Israel. It's called, Judah and Benjamin are the 2 tribes, but it's called Judah.
It's called Judah. So the nation that was initially calling itself Israel up the top is taken over, people leave.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
It's now called Judah.
Right. So
then what happens is Judah is exiled to Babylon in 587 BC.
Another exile.
So
there's more people, the Babylonians would have come in, taken the land, and gotten the people who were living there to just leave.
So what's interesting is that Babylon is pretty well where Abraham came from in the first place.
Oh.
That's
full circle.
I think it's interesting, yeah.
Is that's established fact then? Wow. Yeah, so Abraham was coming from Babylon.
He came from, where Abraham came from was somewhere near present day Kuwait.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then they were exiled and they were back there. And that is when, while they're there, that is when really the Pentateuch and the Bible reached the form that we have it now.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is that if God can call Abram when he's in Babylon and bring him in, can't he bring us back from our exile?
Sure, yeah.
So, Babylonian exile, the temple, Solomon's temple is destroyed.
Who destroys it?
Destroyed by the Babylonians.
Oh, yep.
The sack of Jerusalem and all the people, they were exiled off to Babylon.
And for people who are listening, is modern day Jerusalem in the south of what you're talking about right now?
It's on the south, yeah.
I understand.
Yeah. In a minute, we're going to talk about a map, and when we get to that, I'll get people to pause and open up a map and look at it.
But it's helpful to know that Jerusalem is in the south of where we're talking. And it's still in the south now.
And it's still there, yeah. So currently, you've got to the north, you might remember Jesus one day in John 4 was going to Galilee.
Yes.
And he had to go through Samaria.
Yeah.
And he met this woman at a well. So he's in the south. Judea it was called in those days, not Judah anymore, Judea. He's travelling north through Samaria to Galilee.
Yeah.
So Samaria and Galilee were the territory of those former lost tribes.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, right. We're getting a little bit of biblical history too, aren't we?
It's good to learn. Yeah.
So then Israel is under Babylonian, Greek and Persian rule from 597 BC to 63 BC.
Okay.
So they returned from the exile. About 50 years later.
Yeah.
Jeremiah prophesied it'd be 70 years, but it's really about 50 years later. They returned from the exile. And they return, and you remember Ezra and Nehemiah, and they rebuild the temple.
Yeah. They got everyone to build the bit in front of their own place.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that.
That's the wall.
Yeah.
They built the wall and built the temple.
Okay, I'm thinking of the wall.
You're thinking of the wall, yeah.
But they rebuild it.
Yeah, so that's the books of Ezra and Nehemiah.
Yeah.
And so they return, but they're under Greek and Persian rule. And the end of Nehemiah chapter 8, you know, the return from exile was meant to be sovereignty of the nations.
Yeah.
And they were subject to their rulers, and they were in deep distress.
So they got to come back, but they weren't in control.
They weren't in control.
No.
Then, so what happens is in 63 BC, Rome, the Roman Empire begins.
Oh, this is ringing some familiar bells, because this is Jesus' time coming up.
Yeah, not quite yet, but
we're
coming
close.
up, yeah.
His
so
parents.
Rome takes over the Persian Empire, 63 BC, and Israel, by now renamed Palestine by the Romans, and that's where the name Palestine comes from.
Wow.
They renamed it Palestine, and that went from 63 BC to 330 AD.
Okay.
Right. So we're up to 330 AD from 1700 BC.
We're moving quickly.
Yeah. From 330 to 634 AD now, Palestine was under what we call the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine was named after Byzantium. Byzantium then had its name changed to Constantinople, and then had its name changed to Istanbul.
Yeah, I think we're familiar with this.
Yeah,
this is reminding me of the Crusades a little bit.
Yeah, Crusades are coming, yeah.
Yeah, but that's the area.
Yeah. So they're under Byzantine rule. And then you got Constantine becomes the emperor.
Oh, he's Christian.
And he becomes a Christian, yeah. He had a vision of a cross, and it said, "By this sign conquer." And so he became a Christian, and Christianity became an accepted religion. If you go to Rome and walk through the Vatican Museum, you see Constantine is there, and very important man there. Under Constantine, we get the beginning of Christian pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Constantine's mother was one of the first pilgrims.
Okay.
And she went back, and they built churches. Islam arrives about 600 AD. So what many people don't understand is that for 600 years, in the early part, after those 600 years, there were numerous churches and monasteries all through this, what they call the Holy Land. I like to call it the land of the Holy One. But yeah, so it was a Christian country. I'll put that as quotes again, you know.
Yeah.
But Christianity was important there.
Pervasive.
Yeah. And then the birth of Islam, about 600. And then Palestine became under what we call the Arabs and the Turks, became part of the Muslim Empire from 634 to 1096.
Okay.
So then it's Muslim rule. And then the Crusaders turned up, 1096 to 1291. The Crusaders are there, and they came and drove out the Muslims.
But they were fighting in the name of Christianity.
Yeah, they were. Yeah. And they would have had to free the Holy Land from the pagan Muslims.
So they were still thinking about the Holy Land then. They were thinking, let's go in, let's claim this back in the name of Christianity.
Yeah.
We'll kick these people out, and it all will be well.
Yeah. This is about the land of the Bible, you know.
Yeah. People are attached to it.
Yeah.
Evidently, it's not just people nowadays. It's gone on for a long time.
For a long time, sure has.
Yeah.
And then so from 1291 to 1517, you've got what they call the Mamluks, who are Muslim rulers. And then you get the Ottoman Turks from 1517 to 1918. So for 400 years, Palestine was ruled by what we call the Ottoman Turks. And it's really part of this whole Byzantium thing, Turkey being in charge. The First World War comes along in 1914 to 1918, and that marks the end of Ottoman rule. So the Allied forces drove the Turks out of Palestine. You can find pictures of General Allenby when he arrived in Jerusalem, and he got off his horse to walk in the gate, because this is really an important city in his mind.
So Israel, now modern-day Israel, well, then called Palestine specifically, was conquered and ruled, conquered
and ruled
and conquered, and it continued and continued and continued up until very recent history, First World War,
Yeah.
When the Ottomans were in charge.
Yeah.
And the Ottomans are booted out by the Allied forces.
Yeah.
Okay,
Correct.
I'm following you. Yeah.
Right. Next stage. A really important stage in this history is what we call the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration I'm going to read to us. Arthur James Balfour was a sort of a British Christian. I say a sort of a Christian. You can find on the internet they say he's more a deist than a Christian. But he was a member of Parliament in the British Parliament, and he wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild, who was the ruler of the head of the Zionist Federation. And he wrote, "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with the Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet." This is the British government. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, from this declaration, from, what did you say his name was, Mr. Balfour?
Arthur James Balfour.
James
I think he was Lord, I'm not sure, but he was a member of Parliament.
Not a mister, my bad.
Well, he might be a mister, I don't know.
He says, "Hi, everybody." Yeah. He's sending this
to the Zionist Federation.
Zionist Federation.
I'll say more about that later.
Yeah. And he's saying, I think it's a good idea if this land is for Jewish people, but doesn't mean that Jewish people everywhere have to live here. Like if they're happy living in the States or whatever, they can stay there. Yeah. But it also doesn't mean we're going to kick out people who are there. They're just going to... Is that his land to give away? Is it?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
By the way, it's not him, it's the British government.
Sorry, the British government.
So I liken it to this. New Zealand might like to give Tasmania to the people of Tonga to solve the problem of sea level rise.
Imagine that.
Imagine that.
Okay.
So Tasmania is not ours to give.
No.
But we could give Tasmania to the people of Tonga, and that would solve the problem of sea level rise for them.
So we would write a letter to the Tongan...
Yeah, to Tonga
and say, "Dear Tonga, we'd like you to have Tasmania. We're not going to kick anyone who lives in Tasmania out, but if you guys want to go there, you don't have to, but it's yours if you want it, or you can stay where you are."
And we view with favour giving you Tasmania to live there.
Keeping in mind that New Zealand does not own Tasmania.
Correct.
Okay, and I think I follow you. It's a good analogy.
And the British government didn't own Palestine.
Well, so this in the context of the Allied forces taking over from the Ottomans.
Yeah.
Who owns this land right now?
So I'll just move on a little bit. We call this the Mandate.
All right.
So we talk about the British Mandate, where Britain was responsible for Palestine after the First World War. And then France was responsible for Syria. I don't know whether you call that the French Mandate. I haven't caught up on that. So Britain was responsible for Palestine. So it's Palestine under the British Mandate from 1922 to 1948.
Okay. And these mandates, it's not just this area of the world. I mean, it was after, think about like Germany. You know how they split Germany and they said Russia can have this half and the States, or the USSR can have this half. So the whole mandate doesn't mean it belongs to you. It just means you're in charge of. Yeah. Right?
And it's really a hangover from the age of colonialisation.
Right.
And so... No, Britain, you go and look after it.
You look after it, but it doesn't belong. It's not. You're not gifting the land to Britain or France.
Yeah, but you look after it.
Okay, so you're kind of like a custodian. Okay, correct. I understand. Custodian.
So that's 1922 to 1948, and then in 1947, the United Nations came up with what they call the Petition Plan.
Right.
So in 1947, as a response really to the Balfour Declaration, the United Nations said, well, now we will give to the Jews 54% of this land of Palestine. We have to talk about Palestine in a minute. The Arabs can have 46% of the land. That's 54 plus 46 makes 100. And Jerusalem will be an international zone.
What made them want to do this plan?
So you talk about the proportions or the actual donation?
Why did they need to do this plan?
Well, so growing out of the Balfour Declaration. And you've got to remember too, we need to put in context the Holocaust and anti-Semitism in Europe.
Right.
And Zionism, that we'll talk about in a couple of episodes, grew out of anti-Semitism.
Right.
And so the world, I think, had an uneasy conscience about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. The Jewish people need a homeland, and this is their homeland, and they can have 54% of it. The Arabs will get 46% of it, and Jerusalem can be an international zone.
When they say Arabs, they mean the existing people. So they consider the existing people to be the Arabs, or indigenous Palestinians, or however we want to put it. They get 46. Jewish people can have 54%.
Yeah.
Okay, right. I understand.
An Arab, by the way, an Arab is someone who speaks Arabic. That's how we describe what an Arab is.
So if you learn to speak Arabic...
Well, no, if you learn, you might not be an Arab if you learn to speak it.
Yeah.
But if you're a native speaker, if your heart language is Arabic, you are an Arab. So remember, Balfour said, nothing shall be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
Yeah, so this is not quite...
Yeah.
Not quite right.
Well, yeah, I think it was meaningful. I think it was well intentioned that the Jews could get 54%. Well, I'm not sure about the proportions.
But you might be jeopardising what people who are already there, which goes against the Balfour Declaration. But maybe it would work. Maybe they thought it would be fine.
Yeah. So I have a friend, a Palestinian Christian friend called Alex Awad, and he's got a really interesting life story. But he said prior to 1947, prior to 1948, there were some Jewish people in the land. And they lived next to each other in peace as neighbours.
Like an international community.
Yeah, an international. And they would go to their festivals. They were Muslims and they were Jews and they were Christians. And they would live together with their neighbours and they would go to their festivals and enjoy one another's company.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Like in lots of countries, there is different ethnic makeups and we just get along. Okay, yep.
And Alex Awad said to me one day that there is a myth that Jews and Arabs have always been at war. And he said that's not the case. And so prior to 1947, they lived together well. This was Alex Awad's experience, but that is not to downplay that in other parts of the land of the Holy One, there was great conflict and often riots between the different ethnicities of those who lived there. So moving forward, this is really now becomes a really difficult and sad story. In 1947, Arabs began to be expelled from their homes. So despite what Arthur James Balfour said, Arabs began to be expelled from their homes. And I've got a quote here from Bishop Munib Yunan, who's the bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Jordan in Jerusalem. And it comes out of a book called Witnessing for Peace in Jerusalem and the World that he published in 2003. And Yunan writes, according to the usual interpretation, the Arabs are to blame for the War of Independence. War of Independence broke out in 1948, after the State of Israel was formed. As a Palestinian, I tell you this is a myth, and not only in my opinion. A new wave of research by Israeli historians has documented that much of the story painted in the West does not measure up to reality. The war did not begin in 1948, but shortly after the UN vote on petition in November 1947, when Israeli militias called the Haganah, Irgun and the Stern Gang began attacking Arab communities within the newly drawn borders of Israel. In those 6 months, before a single Iraqi or Jordanian tank had crossed the Jordan River, the Israelis had accomplished two important goals. They had expelled over 500,000 Arabs from their homes, and they had conquered half of Greater Jerusalem. By the time the armistices were signed, they had added a third, an additional 24% of Palestinian land. Thousands of Palestinian Arabs were driven from their homes and became refugees, some in their own countries and some in neighbouring countries. And that's really sobering, I think.
Yeah.
History has said, well, when the State of Israel was formed in 1948, the Arabs wouldn't have it, and it's true, the Arab nations invaded, but this is 6 months before the invasion. There was already Palestinians expelled from their homes.
If I can go back to one thing you said that there's a misconception that Jews and Arabs have always been enemies.
Yeah.
I remember, I don't know if maybe you can myth bust this, but I was told, I can't remember by who growing up, that was Hagar the servant of Abraham?
Abraham.
And the whole idea was that because Abraham was impatient and got Hagar pregnant because of Sarah saying, you can have her, and
I'm getting very old.
Yeah, I'm getting very old. Do you want to? Just and that because she got pregnant, it all kind of fell apart, and she has her son Ishmael.
Correct.
Yeah, and Ishmael and baby Isaac do not get along.
Yeah,
and so Abraham has to pick, and so he picks Isaac, his biological. With her biological son, both of them are biologically his, and Ishmael and Hagar are cast out into the wilderness, and they're left to die, but they don't die. God has mercy on Hagar. I was told growing up that the descendants of Hagar and Ishmael were the Arabs.
Yeah.
And the Muslims came out of that, and that's why they will always fight for the promised land, because their dad is Abraham and he got the promise, and that's why there was some kind of clash. Is there anything?
So Muslims look back to that.
Right.
I think historically it's probably questionable in terms of the genetics. We're talking 4,000 years ago now.
Yeah, and I think it was when you said just earlier you said that the history of Islam, it's not that old actually.
No, 634.
No, 634 AD. Yeah, so that's quite recent, and so I suppose that was something I'd always thought that maybe, and maybe in my mind, how it's built up, I thought Islam was more of an ancient religion, and it kind of had stemmed as this opposition religion.
Yeah. So the Quran turns up that the history of the Quran is really difficult and complicated. I'm by no means an expert on that. But the Quran, what's really interesting is you and I know Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac.
Yes.
Was he not?
Yes.
In the Quran, it's Ishmael.
Oh.
In the Quran, Abraham was going to sacrifice Ishmael.
Okay.
So the Muslims will look back at that. I think in terms of genetic melting pots, it's all pretty difficult.
Yeah, it's been too long. We're all kind of related, when it gets down to that.
Yep. Yeah.
Interesting. Anyway, as you were.
So where we so there's the expulsion of Arabs from their homes, and the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, and the Arabs, I call them Palestinians too, I call it al-Nakba, which is an Arabic word for the catastrophe. They look back on that as a catastrophe. Of course, Jewish people look back on it somewhat differently. In 1949, the United Nations passed UN Resolution number 194, under which the refugees, these 500,000 refugees that have been driven from their homes, Arabs, were entitled to return to their homes.
Because initially we've got the majority of the land can belong to Jews, but the rest Arabs are allowed to live in, so can they go back?
Yeah.
Right.
Can they go back? Right.
Sure.
So I've been in the Aida refugee camp just next door to Bethlehem. It's called AIDA. The Aida refugee camp.
So people can Google that, eh?
You can Google that, yeah. And it's called a camp, but it's buildings. And it's about 1 square kilometre, in which is populated by about 5,000 people.
Oh, my.
Yeah. And so the buildings get higher and higher because you can't go out, so you can build another story on top.
Okay, yeah.
So, and on many of these buildings, on the door, there is a picture of a key. And the key says 194 on it. And many of these families, of course, the initial ones who were driven out of their homes in 1947 are mostly dead by now.
Yeah.
But their descendants are holding on to the keys to their homes.
Because they said the UN resolution said we can go home, so we're waiting for that to be able to be enforced.
We want to go back to our home.
Right.
Now, Jerusalem is 7.4 kilometres from Bethlehem, from the Aida camp.
So is the camp in Bethlehem?
Just outside Bethlehem.
Literally where Jesus was born?
Yeah, so Bethlehem's a big city now. So,
okay, right.
And it was a village. I went to Bethlehem and I stayed in a hotel and I looked out my window and I thought, I got really quite emotional. Somewhere out here Jesus was born.
Yeah. And now it's a supermarket.
Well,
or something.
Yeah, a big market.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know why I saw a supermarket. But just around here is the Aida refugee camp. Where these people
it's only 7 kilometres from Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I could run that.
Yeah. You and I can cross the world and go to Jerusalem
Yeah.
They can't.
They can't. They have. Do
they
they have to stay in the?
They have to stay
in the 1 kilometre.
Yeah. Well, they can come out into the surrounding area, but you see, you've got this big wall, and you want to get through the wall to go.
The wall around Jerusalem, or the wall around their camp.
The wall. There's this. Well, to talk about this wall now, there's a massive wall that Israel has built all around. It's not really contiguous, but it divides Palestinians from their communities and from their land. To get out of Palestine into Israel, you've got to go through the wall and through a checkpoint.
Oh.
If you're a refugee in there, they don't let you through.
No, they'll say, where's your documents? Where are you from?
Where's your documents? No, I don't have any documents.
Yeah, out you go.
They're stateless people, really.
Whereas we come in with our New Zealand passports and we just get to go in.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I follow you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Resolution 194 said they could return to their homes.
And
that
they
hasn't
haven't
happened.
been able. Okay.
1967, June 1967 was what we call the Six-Day War.
Yeah.
And then in the Six-Day War, Israel occupied the West Bank and Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip.
Yep.
So Israel occupied it, and that's where you get the term occupied territories now, because they're Palestinian land but occupied by Israel.
Despite what was initially agreed, where they would get the 50, was it 46%?
54 for Jewish people.
54%. So this is outside that 54%.
Well, they took another 24%, remember, in 1947.
Okay, so
they
they're
had
gaining.
78.
Okay.
They got 78 and Arabs got 22 now.
Right, okay.
And then Israel has occupied that 22. UN Resolution number 242 in 1967 said Israel had to withdraw from those territories, which they haven't done.
No.
Beginning of Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza began in 1967. I'm going to say some more about that either this session or the next session. The Yom Kippur War in 1973 and ended up with a peace treaty with Egypt in 1973. And then in 1981, Israel annexed the Golan Heights. Golan Heights are in the northern Israel, northeast Israel, and it's Syrian territory which Israel annexed in 1981. Now, there's a lot of aquifers under that. Israel doesn't want to give it back because if they do, Syria might turn the tap off.
Yep.
So in 2019, Donald Trump said that was okay. They could have the Golan Heights.
Though
so they're still occupied.
Though it's not his to give away
it's
either.
Not his to give away.
Anyway,
yeah,
seems a lot of giving things away that doesn't belong to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so we're up to 2019 now.
Nice and modern.
Oh, no, not quite. No,
no,
up to 1981, sorry. Donald Trump said in 2019 they could keep the Golan Heights.
Okay.
2002, and we're in the 21st century. And when I first started putting stuff on paper about this, was 2002, and they talked about the roadmap to peace. And you may have heard, well, you might have been a bit young about the roadmap of peace in those days. But George W. Bush was the president, and the USA, Europe, Russia, and the UN got together and decided they would have what they call the roadmap to peace.
And this is also straight after 9/11, 2001. So tensions are a bit high.
Tensions very high, yeah.
It's understatement of the century.
Yeah,
tensions
correct.
are very high.
Yeah.
And there's the sense of we need to sort this out, right? We need peace.
Yeah.
We need to find a way for things to be good.
Yeah, correct.
Cool.
So there's three phase plan.
Right.
First phase, stop the violence.
Good. That's great.
Yeah,
I like that.
Good. Yeah. Second stage, by 2003, there would be a provisional Palestinian state.
Oh, for the indigenous Palestinian people to have theirs separate from the Israeli.
Yeah, and third phase, a final agreement on Jerusalem, borders, settlement, refugees, and a peace treaty.
Okay.
We deal with all these problems that have been there, causing an itch, really. And that was supposed to happen by 2005.
They were going to tidy up the whole Middle East in 3 years.
They were.
Man, that's lofty.
Yeah.
Lofty goals.
Yeah. And it was agreed by all parties.
Yep.
In principle, but never proceeded.
Oh.
And I remember I was putting this on paper back then, thinking there are hopes for the future. And people were expressing hope for the future. But the roadmap to peace never happened.
No.
Israel started, we talked about this fence a minute ago, Israel started building what they refer to as a security fence in 2003. And the Palestinians called it a separation barrier.
Is it a fence or is it a wall?
Well, it's actually a 9-metre high wall.
Okay, so fence is putting it lightly.
Yeah, fence is putting it lightly. And you can walk around on the inside of the wall, and there's nice graffiti. Banksy's got some pictures on it.
Oh.
And there's lots of graffiti on Israel's, what they call separation barrier. There's interesting, near the Ida refugee camp on the wall, there's hello to the Pope, because the Pope visited.
Oh.
And then it says, Kia ora from New Zealand. And I was with a friend of mine from England, and he said, who's Kia ora? So Israel started building this security fence, as they called it, in 2003. Now, if I build a fence on my neighbour's land...
You don't.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
Do you know about property law?
Yeah, no, a little... Look, I mostly know about banking law, but
Right.
I know enough
Yeah.
that you don't build a fence on someone else's land, because then you'll end up in the disputes tribunal.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, this fence is built on Palestinian land.
Oh, no.
And my friends tell me it's porous. You actually can go in and out of it. It's
Right.
meant to be a security fence. But
You
what it
can
actually
go
does...
in and out if you have the right documentation, right?
Well, even there are places where you can go anyway.
Oh.
But generally, it was meant to be security, keep the terrorists out of Israel.
Yeah.
What it does in effect, it divides people from their livelihoods. So I heard a story of a Palestinian family. They had an olive grove, and these olive groves, they tend for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
There's a 200-year-old olive grove that the family had, and they used to tend it.
Yeah.
The wall went up between their home and the olive grove. So one member of the family got a permit to go and tend the olive grove.
Okay. Through the security gate.
Yeah. The 80-year-old grandfather.
Okay.
He got the permit. So of course that's not going to happen. And ultimately then it becomes unoccupied land, and then Israel says, oh, we'll have that land.
Oh, no one's on here.
Yeah,
Let's
no one's
go.
here,
Yeah.
so it's ours.
Okay.
So yeah,
That's quite sad.
There's huge injustice going on
Yeah.
here. Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, was installed as a Palestinian Prime Minister in 2003. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, and Gaza elected Hamas as their government. We're getting a bit of background now.
Yeah.
You see, because as part of the roadmap and everything else, the West said, well, you have elections and we'll have a government that we negotiate with.
Yeah.
The Palestinian Authority is utterly corrupt.
Okay.
And
so
so
yeah.
and that's why they elected Hamas, because the other guys were corrupt. So and of course then the West said, oh, we're not going to...
Yeah, it's
we're not
between
gonna-
bad and worse.
Yeah, we're not going to negotiate with them.
The corrupt or terrorists.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
So we're not going to negotiate with you.
No.
Then the blockade of Gaza happened in 2007.
What does that look like?
So the blockade of Gaza, so people dispute this, but I call it an open-air prison. So there's fences right around Gaza.
Right, wrapping around it.
The seacoast,
Yeah.
the seacoast, which is patrolled by Israeli gunboats and things, and the fences.
So the land is boxed in.
Boxed in.
and then your exit is the water, and the water is patrolled.
Yeah.
Okay, so...
And it's people call it the largest open-air prison in the world.
And that's the blockade. That's the... What's that
The
called?
blockade.
The blockade.
And so Israel lets trucks of supplies go in each day. Normally about 500 trucks a day is sufficient, because there's a couple of million population.
Yeah.
And they know how many people there are, and they know how many calories you need to stay alive. And so that many calories are allowed in through the border each day.
Okay.
Of course, since the events of 23rd of October 2023, the aid trucks have reduced to a trickle.
Yeah.
And so you might get 50 trucks a day.
Well, I suppose if Israel's at a war with Hamas, they're not going to be feeding Hamas.
Yeah, let's not feed them, yeah.
Yeah, no.
And so that's the case that's been gone to the International Court of Justice. They're using starvation as a weapon of war.
Yeah,
And
that's
what's
really
behind
rough,
it.
because then people who are civilians are being
Yeah.
punished.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's not forget nearly 45,000 have been killed, mostly civilians,
Yeah.
and 2/3 women and children.
No.
So, yeah, it is. And this, I'm keen to say this, and I don't like going over it, but this is actually setting some of the context for what happened in October 2023. As a Palestinian friend said to me, how long would you let me stand on your neck before you started retaliating? So this was, and not of course, I don't want to excuse what Hamas did.
No, it's terrorist.
unconscionable, but that's some of the context.
You
and
can
it
see
didn't come
why
from
they
nothing.
might that terrorism might thrive in a
Yeah.
situation like that.
And then we talked about ongoing and increased settlement activity. Not only has Israel have 78% of the land and they occupy 22% of Palestinian land, but there are now 700,000 Jewish settlers in settlements in Palestinian land.
So they're rolling out more settlements.
And they're increasing settlement activity.
Okay.
I have a note here. So TVNZ breakfast on 11th of November this year, 2024. I heard Benjamin Netanyahu say that he had met Donald Trump 3 times. This is just after Donald Trump had been elected. I've met Trump 3 times in recent days, and he and I are on the same page in terms of Israel's expansion.
In quotes.
In quotes, yeah. And then 12th of November, the following day, Bezalel Smotrich, an Israeli government minister, said that 2025 would be the year of the restoration of Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. That's the Israeli government's names for the West Bank.
Yeah.
And he would seek help from Donald Trump to do so.
Okay.
Moreover, Donald Trump has now appointed a fellow called Mike Huckabee, who happens to be a Baptist minister, as the United States ambassador to Israel. Huckabee is on record as stating that Israel has a right to Judea and Samaria, and there is no such thing as an occupation, and there is no such thing as a Palestinian.
Okay.
So politics is important too.
It's interesting how invested the Americans are.
Yeah.
And I suppose, like I said before, that kind of does feed into the post 9/11 mindset. Obviously, lots has happened, but that mindset of we need our own stronghold in the Middle East, and we can do that via Israel.
Israel.
Yeah.
US is Israel's greatest ally. Israel's US's greatest ally in the Middle East. There have been intifadas and uprising in the horrific events of October 2023 and their aftermath. So that's a really quick overview of 4,000 years of history. I wanted to do that, once to set the scene for the whole story and the land of the Bible, but secondly I wanted to set some of the context for the horrific events of October 2023 when Hamas broke out and murdered upwards of 1,000 Jewish people living in, I don't want to call them settlements because this is Israel land, not Palestinian land. We talk about maybe kibbutzes, or kibbutzim as they call them, and living their lives near Gaza, and they broke out and murdered people and took hostages.
Yeah.
What they did was unconscionable.
No, it's wrong.
It cannot be excused, but I was keen to set the context in terms of 17 years of utter oppression of the people of Gaza in their largest open-air prison in the world. And I know people dispute that, but I think the facts speak for themselves in the largest open-air prison in the world, and that is a reaction to that. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really good overview of the history. Like you said, 4,000 years into 40 minutes, so we're doing our best. So we'll cut the episode here, and then next time, when everyone comes back after they've had a cup of tea, we can talk about some definitions, life in the West Bank and Gaza, and also how Christians have responded. Yeah,
and that will be a brief episode.
Yeah.
I'm hoping.
Well, yeah. It would be good to talk about some of those definitions. You use some big words, so I'm looking forward to talking about that.
Okay, well, let's do it.
Well, thank you, Phil.
See you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to Biblical Insights, the Gospel and the Land of the Bible. We hope you gained a deeper understanding of God's Word today. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Email us at biblicalinsightspodcast@gmail.com. A huge thank you to our amazing producer Mike Crudge and our talented audio editor Karis Fotheringham, and thank you to the Baptist NZ Podcast Network for supporting us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please take a moment to review and rate us on your favourite podcast platform. Your 5-star rating and thoughtful reviews help us reach more people with biblical insights. Join us next time on Biblical Insights, the Gospel and the Land of the Bible, as we continue to explore the Bible and its relevance to our everyday lives.